The sergeant hadn't moved from the door for 6 hours. Staff Sergeant Roy Hendricks, military police, stood with his back against the rattling steel and watched the German across the aisle stare out the window like a man watching his own house burn. The prisoner was Luftwaffe, a captain, maybe 30 years old, still wearing the remnants of what had probably been a decent uniform before North Africa happened to it. He'd been quiet since they loaded him at the New York port, not sullen, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from thinking too hard. Now it was 2 a.m. somewhere in Ohio, and the captain's mouth hung slightly open. Hendricks followed his gaze. Through the smudged glass, the Youngstown steel mills rolled past in sheets of orange light. Blast furnaces throwing sparks against a black sky, smokestacks silhouetted like a forest, train after train on parallel tracks, loaded with ore, with coal, with finished steel, and above it all, nothing, no searchlights sweeping. No anti-aircraft batteries, no blackout curtains, just American industry, lit up like a carnival, churning through the night shift like the war existed on another planet. The German turned to look at Hendricks. His English came out slow, careful. "This is normal? Every night?" Hendricks shrugged. "Every night." The captain turned back to the window, said nothing else for the next 100 miles. That moment, or thousands like it, became one of the strangest psychological weapons of the Second World War. Not interrogation, not propaganda films, not re-education programs, just windows, train windows, rolling through the American heartland, showing German prisoners something their own government had promised was impossible. If your family has stories from the war, American or German, doesn't matter. That version matters more than anything in an archive. Drop it in the comments, and if you want more of this, hit subscribe. The trains ran constantly by 1944. Camp Crossville in Tennessee, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Trinidad in Colorado, Camp Clark in Missouri. More than 400 POW camps scattered across 45 states, holding nearly 400,000 German prisoners by war's end. Moving that many men required logistics, and logistics meant rail. The Army could have blacked out the windows, could have run the trains at night through rural darkness, kept the prisoners ignorant. They didn't. Whether by intention or indifference, the War Department let German soldiers see exactly what they were fighting against. The effect was not subtle. A Wehrmacht sergeant captured in Tunisia wrote home that he had not believed America was a real country until he crossed it. The letter took 11 words to say what Goebbels had spent years denying. The factories are real. They stretch forever. Nothing has been bombed. An Afrika Korps officer, interrogated at Fort Hunt in Virginia, told his American questioner that the train ride had been worse than capture itself. In combat, he said, you can still hope. On that train, hope died somewhere around Pittsburgh. The route from East Coast ports to interior camps ran through the industrial belt, Philadelphia, through Pennsylvania coal country, across Ohio steel territory, into the flatlands where grain elevators stood like cathedrals every 30 miles. For men who had spent years being told that American industry was a Jewish fiction, that the Reich's enemies were exhausted and crumbling, that one more push would end it. The view from those windows was not just surprising. It was annihilating. They saw no bomb damage. They saw no rationing lines. They saw no women, no rationing lines. They saw no women digging through rubble for firewood. They saw factory parking lots full of private automobiles, workers who drove their own cars to jobs building tanks. They saw department stores with lit display windows. They saw fat cattle and full silos, and highways without a single military checkpoint. And they understood, in a way that no battlefield defeat could teach them, that they had lost. The question is why? Why did 3 days on an American train break something that 3 years of combat hadn't touched? The Americans cannot build planes. They only know how to make refrigerators and razor blades. Hermann Göring said that in 1942. Said it publicly, to German industrialists with cameras rolling. The Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe, second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, standing at a podium and explaining why the enemy across the Atlantic was not worth worrying about. The men on those trains had grown up on that message. To understand what the industrial heartland did to their minds, you have to understand what those minds had been fed for a decade. Nazi propaganda about America wasn't casual racism or wartime insults. It was a systematic, state-funded, relentlessly repeated campaign to convince Germans that the United States was a paper tiger, decadent and divided, utterly incapable of real war. The core thesis was simple. America was a mongrel nation. Blacks and Jews and immigrants had diluted whatever vigor the country once possessed. Its culture was jazz music and gangster films, entertaining perhaps, but not serious. Its economy was controlled by Jewish financiers who cared only for profit, not national strength. Its workers were lazy and its soldiers soft. Its factories looked impressive on paper, but would prove brittle under pressure. Goebbels hammered this daily. The propaganda ministry produced films showing American breadlines from the Depression, American race riots, American crime statistics. They pointed to isolationist sentiment as proof that Americans had no stomach for European war. They mocked Roosevelt as a cripple, literally and figuratively, propped up by shadowy interests. When American factories started producing war material, German radio explained it away. The numbers were exaggerated. Jewish propaganda meant to frighten. Even if some production existed, the quality would be inferior, rushed and shoddy, built by workers who punched clocks rather than fought for a cause. German craftsmen built weapons with pride. Americans built products for profit. The B-17 was a flying coffin, easy prey for Luftwaffe fighters. The Sherman tank was thin-skinned and outgunned, a death trap for its crew. American infantry? Soft boys raised on ice cream and automobiles, no match for soldiers hardened by years of European struggle. This wasn't background noise. This was the water these men swam in. In Hitler Youth meetings and Wehrmacht training films, in newspaper editorials and letters from home, the message stayed constant. America is not a real threat. Their entry into the war changes nothing. One good push, and their coalition collapses. The soldiers who landed in North Africa or Italy or France carried this worldview into combat. When they encountered American firepower, the overwhelming artillery, the endless air support, the sheer volume of materiel, many found ways to explain it within the framework they'd been given. Lucky shots, local superiority, temporary advantage. The Americans had surprised them, but the Reich would adapt. Germany had overcome worse. Capture didn't immediately shatter this. Plenty of POWs spent their first weeks in American custody, still believing in final victory. The Wehrmacht's reverses were setbacks, not defeats. The wonder weapons would turn the tide. The alliance between capitalists and communists would fracture. Then they got on the trains. The journey from East Coast processing to a camp in Texas or Colorado took roughly 3 days. 3 days of watching America scroll past like a film reel nobody in Berlin had approved. 3 days of seeing the factories that weren't supposed to exist, producing at volumes that weren't supposed to be possible, suffering zero damage from bombs that weren't supposed to be falling on German cities instead. Every hour on those rails was an hour of direct contradiction. Not argument, contradiction. The evidence came through the glass, mile after mile, until the propaganda collapsed under its own weight. Göring's refrigerator line became a particularly bitter joke among prisoners. The Americans could indeed build refrigerators. They could also build 50,000 aircraft in a single year while keeping their refrigerator factories running, and their steelworkers drove home in private cars afterward. The tag was made of brass, stamped with a 6-digit number and a camp designation. It hung from a wire loop meant to circle a man's wrist. 391,706 of these tags were issued between 1942 and 1945, one for every German soldier processed through American custody and shipped to the continental United States. 391,000. That number requires a pause. The entire Wehrmacht invasion of France in 1940 had used fewer men than America eventually held in domestic POW camps. The Reich's Sixth Army, destroyed at Stalingrad in the greatest German defeat of the war, numbered roughly 330,000. America captured more than that and transported them across an ocean infested with U-boats, then dispersed them to camps in 45 states, fed and housed them, put them to work, while simultaneously fighting a two-front war against the most powerful military alliance in history. The smell of the processing centers stayed with the prisoners. Disinfectant powder that burned the nostrils, sprayed liberally on men who hadn't bathed properly in weeks. The chemical sharpness of DDT dusted into hair and clothing. Soap that felt like sandpaper and smelled like nothing any of them recognized from home. They came off the ships at Boston, New York, Norfolk, New Orleans, unloaded in batches of several hundred, marched past Red Cross tables offering coffee and donuts, actual donuts, fresh, as if sugar weren't rationed anywhere on earth, then processed through medical checks, fingerprinting, photography, documentation. American clerks with typewriters recorded name, rank, unit, capture location. German speakers asked basic questions. MPs with carbines stood at the doors looking bored. The speed was the strangest part. German bureaucracy ground slowly, deliberately. American processing moved like a factory floor. A prisoner could go from ship gangway to rail car in under 8 hours. Efficiency without malice. The Americans weren't cruel, just busy. They had somewhere to put these men and something for them to do once they got there. America didn't just accept prisoners. America needed them. By 1943, the labor shortage had become critical. 12 million American men were in uniform or heading there. The farms still needed harvesting. The canneries still needed workers. Cotton didn't pick itself, and the women already working factory shifts couldn't also work the fields. Mexican bracheros helped. So did high school students and anyone else who could swing a hoe. It wasn't enough. German prisoners filled the gap. War Department policy allowed POW labor under Geneva Convention rules. No war production, no dangerous conditions, reasonable hours, payment in scrip. Prisoners cut pulpwood in Maine, picked cotton in Arizona, canned vegetables in Wisconsin. They laid railroad ties and dug irrigation ditches. They cleared brush from land that would become post-war suburbs. The camps themselves ranged from converted civilian conservation corps facilities to purpose-built compounds in empty desert. Camp Hearn in Texas held nearly 5,000 men in wooden barracks behind barbed wire, with a mess hall, a canteen, even a camp orchestra. Camp Concordia in Kansas had a swimming pool. Some installations felt more like minimum security prisons than POW facilities. The Geneva Convention required that captured enlisted men be housed no worse than the capturing army's own soldiers, and American GIs in stateside training lived reasonably well. This was the scale that destroyed German morale. The treatment was decent, but that wasn't what broke them. The Americans barely bothered with formal re-education programs until late in the war. What did it was the industrial capacity to process hundreds of thousands of enemies, move them 5,000 miles, disperse them across a continent, and put them to useful work without breaking stride. The Germans had fought hard. The Americans had treated their capture as a logistics problem, solved it, and moved on to the next item on the list. The German home front in 1944 ran on 500 grams of bread per day. That was the adult civilian ration, roughly 18 ounces. Add 250 grams of meat per week, when available, 40 grams of cooking fat. Coffee had vanished entirely, replaced by ersatz made from roasted barley and chicory root. Women queued at 4 a.m. for vegetables that might or might not arrive. Children learned to identify the whistle of falling bombs by type. High explosive made a different sound than incendiary. The men captured in Tunisia or Sicily or Normandy had left this. Letters from home, the ones that got through, described it in careful language that evaded censors but told the truth. Your mother is thinner. The apartment next door no longer exists. Aunt Margit was relocated to her sister's because her building caught fire in the last raid. We are managing. Meanwhile, in Kansas, German prisoners ate better than most European civilians. The Geneva Convention required that POWs receive rations equivalent to the capturing power's rear echelon troops. American rear echelon troops ate well, meat at every meal, white bread, fresh fruit sometimes, coffee, real coffee, the beans these men hadn't smelled in years. The caloric intake at most camps exceeded what Wehrmacht soldiers received in the field. The British had tried something similar with their German prisoners. Adequate food, reasonable conditions, but the effect wasn't the same. Britain was close. Britain had been bombed. British rations were tight too, and prisoners could see it. The sacrifice was shared, however unwillingly. Anyway, that wasn't the point Americans were making. Americans weren't making a point at all. They simply had food, so they provided food. The abundance wasn't calculated. It was just there. German cities in 44 existed under permanent blackout. No streetlights, no lit windows, vehicle headlamps painted over except for a narrow slit. The darkness was practical. British bombers came at night, and any light source became a navigation aid for men trying to find your factory, your rail yard. Women walked home from 12-hour shifts in munitions plants, through streets they navigated by memory, because nothing could be seen. The lucky ones carried small flashlights with blue filters. Most felt their way along building walls. The prisoners on those American trains passed through cities that blazed. Not just the steel mills, downtown Cleveland, Pittsburgh at rush hour, Indianapolis with its department store windows full of merchandise, lit for evening shoppers, diners with neon signs advertising hamburgers and pie. Gas stations open at midnight because people drove places at midnight, because gasoline wasn't rationed to nothing, because the war hadn't touched any of this. Back home, German industrial workers pulled double shifts in factories that American bombers visited weekly. The Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants had been hit 5 times. The synthetic fuel works at Leuna operated under constant threat, repair crews working as fast as destruction crews demolished. Production continued. German engineering was remarkable that way. But the cost was measured in sleepless nights and shattered nerves and the mourning lists of who hadn't survived the night shift. American factories ran 3 shifts in peace. Workers complained about overtime rates and union disputes. They drove their own automobiles to plants that had never heard an air raid siren, parked in lots that stretched for acres, punched clocks, built tanks or aircraft or ammunition, punched out, drove home. Their basements held no shelters, their hallways no buckets of sand for incendiary bombs. The contrast was not subtle, not something prisoners had to think about or interpret. A man who had watched his sister dig turnips from a frozen garden to supplement rations could see an American grocery store through a train window and understand immediately what it meant. A man who had pulled rubble watch duty in Hamburg after the firestorm could see an intact American skyline and know, without anyone explaining it, that his country was losing a war of production it could never win. 0600, Norfolk Naval Yard, August 1944. The prisoners filed down the gangway in groups of 50, wrists tagged, names checked against manifests, shuffling toward a train platform that smelled of coal smoke and creosote. Most expected the worst. They had heard stories. German propaganda had covered Soviet treatment of POWs, the starvation, the slave labor, the mass graves in frozen earth. The British were supposedly more civilized, but crowded, resource-strapped. America was an unknown. Some men whispered that the Americans shot prisoners in the field and only transported the ones useful for intelligence. Others believed they'd be put to work in mines or factories, expendable labor for the capitalist machine. A few optimists thought they might be exchanged. Nobody expected what they got. The rail cars were passenger coaches, not cattle cars, not freight wagons with straw on the floor. Actual seats, worn but functional, the kind American civilians rode. The windows weren't boarded. Guards stood at each end of the car, 2 MPs with carbines, young men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. One of them was reading a paperback novel. An Unteroffizier named Helmut Becker, captured at Cherbourg 6 weeks earlier, would later describe his confusion to an American interviewing officer. He kept waiting for the conditions to change. The decent treatment at the processing center had been for show, obviously. International observers, perhaps. Now, on the train, the real transport would begin. The cars would detach, or they'd be moved to something worse at the next station. The next station came. Nothing changed. The train rolled west through Virginia farmland. Green fields, fat cattle, barns that hadn't been bombed. The guards handed out sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, white bread, some kind of processed meat, mustard. One prisoner refused to eat, convinced it was poisoned. His seatmate ate both portions and suffered nothing. Hours passed. The MPs rotated shifts. A new pair came through, equally indifferent. One offered cigarettes to prisoners who wanted them. American cigarettes, factory-made with filters. A luxury item in Germany even before the war. The silence from the guards was the strangest part. German military culture ran on shouting. Orders were barked. Discipline was enforced through volume and intimidation. These Americans barely spoke. When they did, it was practical. Bathroom break in 10 minutes, water at the next stop, don't block the aisle. No insults or ideology. No apparent interest in the men they were guarding beyond keeping them in their seats. Becker noticed something else. The guards weren't afraid. In his experience, men guarding prisoners stayed alert, tense, ready for trouble. These MPs slouched against the doors like men waiting for a bus. Their carbines hung loose. They made no effort to intimidate, no effort to establish dominance. It was as if the possibility of a prisoner uprising had never occurred to them, or as if it wouldn't matter if it did. He counted heads. Roughly 200 Germans on this train, guarded by perhaps a dozen Americans. The ratio should have felt like an opportunity. Instead, it felt like a statement. The Americans weren't worried because they didn't need to be. Where would the prisoners go? What would they do if they overpowered the guards? They were somewhere in the middle of a continent they'd never seen, surrounded by a population that outnumbered them by millions, with no weapons, no maps, no allies, no plan. The train kept moving, west through the Appalachians, the mountains that supposedly didn't exist in the flat, featureless America of German imagination, through tunnels blasted from solid rock, past small towns with church steeples and water towers, filling stations and streets full of automobiles. The prisoners watched. Most said nothing. The men who'd been loudest about final victory, about wonder weapons and inevitable triumph, grew quieter with each passing mile. By nightfall, the first cities appeared on the horizon, glowing. In the Shenandoah Valley, the morning fog lifted around 0700 and revealed a country that had never seen war. The train had stopped at a siding to let a freight pass, and for 20 minutes the prisoners sat motionless with nothing to do but look. What they saw was pasture land stretching to blue mountains, white farmhouses with red barns, silos fat with grain. Horses grazed in paddocks. A farmer drove a tractor across a field that had never been cratered by artillery, never been trenched, never been fought over. The roadsides held no burned-out vehicles, no roofless buildings, no refugees with handcarts. The grass was green because it had been allowed to grow, watered by rain instead of blood. The smell came through the cracked windows, hay and manure and wet earth, farm smells that reminded some prisoners of Bavaria or Saxony before everything changed. One man from the Rhineland, where Allied bombers had made farming a dice game between planting and destruction, pressed his forehead against the glass and didn't move until the train lurched forward again. The small towns were worse. They passed through a dozen before noon, each one a minor catastrophe for men who'd been told America was a nation of gangsters and race chaos and industrial squalor. Main streets with brick storefronts, churches with intact steeples, schools with playgrounds full of children. The automobiles were everywhere. Not military vehicles, not requisition trucks, but private cars parked at angles in front of hardware stores and barber shops, driven by civilians who apparently had somewhere to go and the gasoline to get there. One town had a movie theater with a marquee advertising a film, as if entertainment were still a thing that mattered, as if people had time for it. A grocery store's plate glass window displayed pyramids of oranges and canned goods. A woman in a print dress carried shopping bags to her car, loaded them in the back, drove away. Nobody stopped her. Nobody checked her papers. The bags looked heavy. Back home, A woman carrying that much food would have been arrested for hoarding or attacked by desperate neighbors. Here it was Tuesday. The converts appeared by afternoon. Not dramatic conversions, not announcements, just silence where there had been argument. A Feldwebel from the Waffen-SS, who had spent the first day insisting the Americans were showing them a carefully staged route through their only prosperous region, stopped talking about it. The evidence had become too continuous. They had traveled hundreds of miles and seen nothing but abundance. The staged route theory required believing that America had constructed an elaborate theater production across multiple states, populated it with millions of actors, and maintained it flawlessly for the benefit of a few hundred prisoners who would never report home. The simpler explanation was that this was real. That Germany had declared war on a country that looked like this, that ran like this, that could spare gasoline for civilians and oranges for grocery displays while fighting simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific. The Feldwebel sat with his arms crossed and watched a freight train pass, flat cars loaded with Sherman tanks, dozens of them, fresh from some factory, heading east toward a port. The tanks were painted but not yet marked for units, new production. The line of them took 2 full minutes to pass. Nobody counted out loud, but everyone was counting. When the last flat car cleared, the Feldwebel turned away from the window and stared at his hands. The men around him found reasons to look elsewhere. Something had broken, and acknowledging it felt indecent. 2,200 hours, somewhere in Ohio. The train had stopped again, this time at a freight junction, where 6 lines converged under arc lights that turned the night white. The prisoners couldn't sleep anyway. They pressed against the windows on the north side of the car and watched what passed. Sherman tanks on flat cars, dozens, then scores, then more than anyone bothered counting. 2.5 trucks with canvas covers still crisp from the factory. Jeeps stacked 3 high on specially designed racks. Crated aircraft, fuselages in one car, wings in another, engines in a third, marked for assembly at depots overseas. Artillery pieces with their barrels wrapped in protective grease paper. Ammunition in wooden boxes stacked to the roofline of boxcars that stretched beyond the arc lights into darkness. One train passed, then another, then a third. The junction stayed busy. Switchers moved cars from track to track. Men with lanterns signaled in the distance. The machine kept running. A lieutenant named Erich Müller, 23 years old, formerly of the 12th SS Panzer Division, had been wounded at Caen and captured at a field hospital. He'd commanded a Panther tank for 11 days before a British shell took his left arm below the elbow. In the post-war interviews collected by American historians, his testimony about that night stands out for its precision. "I counted for 40 minutes, he said. I stopped at 214 tanks. They were still coming. And this was one junction, in the middle of the night, in what the guards told us was not even an important rail hub. I thought about our replacement situation in Normandy. We waited weeks for a single Panther. We cannibalized wrecks for parts. We fought over allocation of every vehicle. And here were tanks by the hundreds, moving like consumer goods, like rolls of cloth or bags of grain, just another commodity." The other prisoners had their own versions. A Fallschirmjäger sergeant described staring at the crated aircraft and trying to calculate production rates, then giving up because the numbers made no sense. A naval enlisted man from a U-boat sunk in the Atlantic watched trucks roll past and wondered how many his boat would have needed to destroy to make any difference, and knew the answer was more than existed in his entire fleet. The Wehrmacht had fought the Eastern Front on a logistics margin, measured in single-digit percentages. Every shell counted, every drop of fuel. The Soviets had more of everything, but the Soviets also lost it faster, bled it out across the steppes in quantities that staggered comprehension. The war in the East felt like a calculation. Germany might win if it just held on, just kept killing, just waited for the Bolshevik system to collapse under its own contradictions. This was different. Not a wounded empire hemorrhaging resources, a factory that hadn't started breathing hard yet. The arc lights blazed because electricity wasn't rationed. The trains ran on time because coal wasn't scarce. The tanks kept coming because steel was inexhaustible and labor was plentiful, and the country building them had never been bombed at all. Müller stared at his remaining hand, the one that had once gripped the commander's periscope of a Panther tank, the finest armored vehicle in the world, a machine that could destroy 4 Shermans before breakfast. Germany built 1,700 Panthers in all of 1944, straining every forge and foundry in the Reich. He had just watched more tanks than that pass in a single night, at a single junction, heading for a single port. I understood then, he told his interviewer. Not believed, understood. We had lost the war in 1941, when we declared against America. Everything after that was just motion, movement without meaning, boys dying for arithmetic that couldn't work. The train lurched forward around 0100. The prisoners found their seats. Nobody spoke. The arc lights faded behind them, but the sound of the passing freights carried through the darkness for miles. Steel wheels on steel rails, the rhythm of an economy that hadn't even noticed it was at war. The war ended on that train before it ended anywhere else. Not for everyone, not all at once. But by the third morning, the arguments had started, and the arguments told you everything about who had broken and who was still holding on. It began over breakfast. The guards handed out the same waxed paper packets as the day before. Bread, meat, an apple this time. A Gefreiter from Dresden, 19 years old, looked at the apple and said something about his mother standing in line for 6 hours to get turnips. Just an observation. The man next to him, an Oberfeldwebel with an Iron Cross and 11 years in the Wehrmacht, told him to shut his mouth. Defeatist talk. The Gefreiter said he wasn't being defeatist, he was being accurate. The Oberfeldwebel hit him. The MPs broke it up in seconds. No shouting, no chaos, just 2 guards moving down the aisle, separating the men, pointing at seats. The Oberfeldwebel sat where they told him. The Gefreiter wiped blood from his lip and said nothing else, but the silence afterward was different, charged. Men who had been avoiding each other's eyes now watched to see who would speak next. A Stabsfeldwebel named Konrad Wendt, career NCO, veteran of France, Russia, and Normandy, stood up 3 rows back. He didn't raise his voice. He asked a question. Had anyone on the train seen anything in 3 days that suggested Germany could win? Anyone? Had they seen a single bombed building, a single rationed meal, a single sign that America was suffering? The Oberfeldwebel started to answer. Wendt cut him off. He wasn't asking about wonder weapons or final victory or the Führer's genius. He was asking about what they had seen. With their eyes, through the windows. Had any of it looked like a country losing a war? The car went quiet enough to hear the wheels on the rails. A young lieutenant, Wendt didn't know his name, said that morale was a weapon too. That doubt was what the enemy wanted. Wendt laughed. not cruelly, just tired. He asked the lieutenant how many tanks he'd counted at the junction last night. The lieutenant didn't answer. Wentz said he'd counted 231 before he lost track. He asked if anyone thought German industry could match that. In a month. In a year. Ever. The smell of the morning. Coffee from somewhere. Bacon grease. The green scent of farmland through the cracked windows, mixed with the stale air of men who hadn't bathed in days. Someone coughed. The Oberfeldwebel stared at the floor. The true believers had run out of arguments that didn't sound insane. What happened over the next hour wasn't dramatic. No more fights, no speeches, just small conversations. 2 or 3 men at a time, voices low. The younger soldiers asked questions they'd been afraid to ask. The older ones answered honestly for the first time. A few men wouldn't participate, sat rigid, staring forward, refusing to acknowledge what was happening. But they were outnumbered now, and they knew it. The guards noticed the change. One of the MPs, a corporal from somewhere in the Midwest, corn-fed, maybe 22, walked the length of the car and stopped near Wentz's seat. He didn't say anything, just looked at the Germans the way a man looks at a dog that's finally stopped barking. Then he went back to his post. By noon, the last true believer in the car, a Waffen-SS Rottenführer who had spent 2 days muttering about Jewish conspiracies and secret weapons, stopped talking entirely. Nobody had argued with him. Nobody had confronted him. The evidence had simply become too heavy. He sat with his hands in his lap and watched Indiana slide past the windows, green and golden and whole, and whatever fire had kept him going, guttered out like a candle in a draft. The train rolled on. The prisoners sat with their new knowledge, still learning its weight. In Kansas, the horizon went flat, and the sky opened up like nothing they'd ever seen. Camp Concordia rose out of wheat fields that stretched unbroken to the edge of the world. Guard towers, barbed wire, long wooden barracks painted white. Standard prisoner of war facility. What wasn't standard was everything else. The mess hall served them the first night. Pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans from a can, which meant green beans in August, which meant green beans whenever anyone wanted them. Bread without sawdust filler. Coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz barley substitute they'd choked down since 1942. A Gefreiter from Hamburg, a man who'd survived Stalingrad as a supply clerk and knew exactly what starvation looked like, sat with his tray and didn't eat for several minutes. He just looked at it. The pork chop was larger than his weekly meat ration back home. The potato portion would have fed his family for 2 days. When he finally started eating, he did it slowly, like a man trying to memorize something. The guards didn't care. That was the part that broke the last holdouts. German guards would have watched, would have counted, would have made sure every gram was accounted for. These Americans wandered the mess hall like men supervising a cafeteria, not a prison. Bored. One of them read a newspaper while the prisoners ate. Another talked to a colleague about a baseball game. The Cardinals, something about a pitcher. They carried weapons, but loosely, the way a farmer carries a rake. The message was unmistakable. You are not dangerous enough to worry about. The re-education program started within the first week. Camp authorities showed films about American democracy, distributed German-language newspapers printed in New York, organized discussion groups led by anti-Nazi émigrés. The program had been designed by psychologists and propaganda experts who understood that belief could be dismantled systematically. They needn't have bothered. The train had already done the work. A camp administrator named Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Peterson, career Army, former schoolteacher from Minnesota, wrote in his monthly report that the August 1944 transport from Norfolk arrived substantially pre-converted. His word, pre-converted. The men had seen too much between the docks and Kansas to require convincing. The discussion groups became something else entirely. Not persuasion sessions, but grief counseling. Men working through what it meant that everything they'd fought for was already lost. That their friends had died for a war that couldn't be won. That the whole enterprise had been, from the moment Germany declared war on the United States, a collective suicide dressed up as national destiny. One session transcript survives in the National Archives, recorded by a military stenographer in September 1944. A prisoner identified only as K.W., almost certainly Conrad Wendt, the Stabsfeldwebel from the train, spoke for 11 minutes about the freight junction in Ohio. He described the tanks, the timing, the arc lights. He described what it felt like to count past 200 and realize the number didn't matter, that counting was meaningless when the supply was infinite. Then, he said something the stenographer marked with an asterisk, flagged for the attention of higher authorities. We were told we were fighting for civilization against chaos, but I watched that junction, and I understood. We were the chaos. We were the ones destroying things. They were the ones building. The room went silent after that. The transcript notes only. Long pause. No response from other participants. Outside the barracks that night, the Kansas sky blazed with stars unpolluted by blackout curtains, or searchlights, or the glow of burning cities. The wheat fields whispered in a wind that smelled of nothing but grain and dust and distance. Somewhere to the east, the war ground on. Boys died in hedgerows. Ships burned in the Pacific. The machine kept feeding itself. But here in Kansas, behind wire that felt almost ceremonial, 400 men lay in bunks and stared at ceilings and tried to imagine what home would look like when they finally returned to it. If there was a home left. If there was anything left at all. Conrad Wendt stepped off a repatriation ship at Bremerhaven in January 1946, 17 months after the train ride through Ohio. The city looked like something had chewed it and spit it out. Rubble lined the streets in neat piles. The Germans had already started organizing their destruction, cataloging it, preparing to rebuild. He carried a canvas bag with 3 changes of clothes, a razor, and a pocket Bible he'd been given at Camp Concordia by a Lutheran chaplain from Wisconsin. The Bible still had wheat chaff pressed between the pages. The repatriation process moved 400,000 German POWs from American custody back to occupied Germany between 1945 and 1948. Most returned to cities that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Hamburg was 40% rubble. Cologne had lost 90% of its center. Dresden, where the young Gefreiter who'd been hit over an apple came from, had burned so completely that accurate casualty figures remain disputed to this day. These men walked through the ruins, knowing exactly why. They'd seen the factories that built the bombers. They'd watched the freights carrying the ordnance. The arithmetic had worked out precisely as they'd calculated on that train. Post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities found that former POWs held in the United States showed markedly different attitudes than those held in British or Soviet custody. 83% described American treatment as correct or good. 71% expressed what interviewers categorized as realistic assessments of why Germany lost, meaning they cited industrial capacity rather than betrayal, bad luck, or divine punishment. The train had been an education. The camps had been graduate school. Erich Müller, the one-armed Panther commander, returned to what had been Stuttgart and found his family's apartment building converted to gravel. His mother and two sisters had survived by relocating to a cousin's farm in Bavaria. He found work as a clerk in a machine tool company, American-owned as it happened, part of the occupation's industrial restructuring. He married in 1949, 3 children. He never spoke publicly about the war until a local historian interviewed him in 1982. And even then, he talked mostly about the train, the tanks at the junction, the arc lights, and then the moment when counting stopped mattering. Wendt became a union organizer in the Ruhr, steel workers, then metal workers, then a regional federation that helped rebuild German industry under Allied supervision. His American captors would have appreciated the irony. The man who'd watched Sherman tanks roll past in Ohio spent 30 years helping rebuild the forges that would eventually produce Leopard tanks for NATO. He retired in 1979, died in 1991. The files at the National Archives contain fragments of what these men thought, scattered across debriefing reports and interview transcripts and the occasional letter written to American contacts years later. A pattern emerges. The men who'd been broken on the train didn't describe it as breaking. They described it as waking up, seeing clearly for the first time, understanding that belief could be measured against reality, and reality always won. Somewhere in the Bundesarchiv, there's a form Wendt filled out in 1951, applying for a passport. Under the section asking for foreign travel history, he listed United States of America, August 1944 to January 1946, prisoner of war. Nothing else. No elaboration, just dates and a status. The freight junction in Ohio is still there. 6 rail lines still converge under lights that burn all night. The trains carry different cargo now. Containers from Pacific ports, grain from the plains, coal from Wyoming, automobiles assembled in Kentucky. The switching yard handles about 90 trains per day. The men who work it have never heard of Konrad Wendt or Erich Müller or the transport that passed through one night in August 1944. They have schedules to keep.